At 2:14 in the afternoon, the alarm system in an Ohio control room quietly stopped working. Nobody noticed. For the next 92 minutes, the man responsible for keeping the lights on across 5 states sat in front of screens that were lying to them. The screens said everything was fine. Outside, 3 high-voltage lines had already burned into trees and shut down. The operators had no idea. When another utility called to warn them, they checked their displays, saw nothing wrong, and said so. At 4:10 and 34 seconds, the grid stopped pretending. What happened next took 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, 50 million people across 8 American states and 1 Canadian province lost electricity, not gradually, not region by region, but in a wave that moved faster than any human being could react to. Power plants that had been running perfectly 2 seconds earlier disconnected themselves and shut down, not because they were damaged, because they were programmed to. And here's the part almost nobody understands about that day. The blackout wasn't the disaster. The blackout was the grid saving itself. What you're about to hear is what happens in the 60 minutes after that decision is made. The hour that determines whether your city gets power back tonight or doesn't get it back for months. Because there's a clock running in that hour, most people have never heard of it, and it is far less forgiving than you think. Minute 1, nothing happens. That's the strange part. Nobody panics in minute 1. The refrigerator stops. The little electronic hum that lives underneath every modern room, the one you stopped hearing years ago, is suddenly gone, and the silence is so complete it feels physical. You look up. You wait for it to come back. It doesn't. You go find your phone. 4 bars. Everything looks normal. You open a browser to check if it's just you, and the page loads, and you relax slightly. This is the moment where almost every person makes the same assumption. The power went out. It'll be back soon. You've lived through this a dozen times. Storm knocks down a line. Crew comes out. 3 hours later, you're watching television again. But to understand why this one is different, you have to understand what the electrical grid actually is, and it is not what you think. It isn't a network of wires delivering power from A to B. It's a machine. One single continuous machine spread across an entire continent, and every generator connected to it is physically spinning in perfect unison. 60 rotations per second. Every turbine in every plant, from a hydroelectric dam in Washington to a gas plant in Georgia, locked together in the same rhythm, held there by physics. 60 hertz. That's the heartbeat. And here is the thing that keeps grid engineers awake at night. The grid stores almost nothing. There is no giant battery under the country. Electricity is generated and consumed in the same instant every second of every day. Supply is matched to demand within a fraction of a percent, forever, automatically. Which means, if the balance breaks, the heartbeat changes. Drop below 59.4 hertz, and the system starts automatically cutting off customers to save itself. Drop to 58, and something worse begins. The generators themselves start disconnecting, and every generator that drops out makes the imbalance worse, which drops the frequency further, which knocks out the next generator. That's not a blackout anymore. That's a cascade. And once it starts, no human being on Earth is fast enough to stop it. That's what took 7 minutes in 2003. So back to your dark living room. Minute 1. You're standing there with a phone that still works, mildly annoyed. 3 miles away, at a 4-way intersection, the traffic lights have gone dark. Not blinking red. Dark. Legally, every driver approaching that intersection is now required to treat it as a four-way stop, and roughly the way you'd expect, some of them do. The first collision in a major blackout typically happens within the first 10 minutes, and it isn't the crash that matters, it's what the crash does to the road behind it. Because at this exact moment, something else is happening across the city. Every person who was at work is deciding to go home, all at once, in a city that has just lost every traffic signal. Traffic doesn't slow down. It solidifies, and that matters far more than it sounds like it should, for a reason that won't become obvious for another 39 minutes. Meanwhile, in a high-rise downtown, the elevators have stopped. Modern elevators are designed for this. They glide to the nearest floor and open. Most people get out within minutes. Most. And somewhere in that same building, in a stairwell with no windows, someone is discovering that emergency lighting is powered by batteries with a rated life of 90 minutes. Now watch your phone. You still have full bars. You still have data. And you have no idea that a countdown started the moment the lights went out. Every cell tower in your city runs on grid power. When that power fails, the tower switches to a battery cabinet at its base. And that battery is not designed to run a tower for a day. It's designed to bridge a gap. Depending on the site, the equipment, the temperature, and how hard people are hammering the network, you're looking at something between 2 and 8 hours. Except nobody is going to get the full window, because at the exact moment the batteries start draining, call volume across the city goes vertical. Everyone calls someone. Millions of people simultaneously on a network built with the assumption that they wouldn't. The network doesn't crash dramatically. It degrades. Calls fail. Texts hang. And the towers with the heaviest traffic burn through their batteries. The fastest, which means the most crowded parts of the city, go silent first. Some towers have generators. Those generators have fuel tanks. Those fuel tanks are refilled by trucks. Remember the traffic. And there's a second thing happening on that network that emergency planners genuinely dread. 911 centers are hardened. They have generators. They have redundancy. They are among the last things in a city to go dark. That isn't the failure point. The failure point is that in the first 30 minutes of a blackout, a significant share of the people calling 911 are not reporting an emergency. They're calling to ask when the power is coming back. It happens in every major outage, in every city. Without exception, thousands of calls into a system sized for dozens, and every one of them occupies a dispatcher who's not talking to the person trapped in the elevator. And the calls that should be getting through often can't. A cordless home phone needs a powered base station. Internet-based phone service needs a powered modem. Both are dead. So the emergency traffic gets funneled onto the same cellular network that's already saturated and already draining. Which means, right now, in minute 11, the gap between the number of people who need help and the number of people who can ask for it is the widest it will be all night. Now, minute 9, you decide to be smart. You'll go fill up the car. You drive to the gas station slowly because of the intersections, and the lot is already full, and every pump is dead. There are 20,000 gallons of gasoline in the ground beneath your feet, and not one drop of it is coming up, because the pump that lifts it is electric. Inside the store, the card reader is dark. The ATM on the wall is dark. And this is where something very old and very quiet reasserts itself. In the first hour of a major blackout, the entire American economy reverts to cash. and almost nobody is carrying any. But none of that is the real problem. The real problem is upstairs. And it's already started. Somewhere in your city, there's a water tower. Most people assume it's a reservoir storage for a dry spell. It isn't. It's a pressure device. Water is pumped up into it when the grid is running, and gravity pushes it back down through the pipes under the street, which is why water comes out of your tap with force instead of dribbling. When the grid dies, the pumps that fill that tower die with it. The tower keeps working. It just stops refilling. You now have somewhere between several hours and about a day of water pressure in the system, depending on the city, the season, and how many people are using it. And in minute 12 of a blackout, usage doesn't drop. It spikes. Because a certain number of people in every city immediately start filling bathtubs. But if you live above roughly the 6th floor of a building, you don't get any of that grace period. High-rises can't be served by gravity alone. They use electric booster pumps to push water up. Those pumps are already off. Which means in a city like New York or Chicago or Atlanta, hundreds of thousands of apartments lost running water before their occupants finished wondering why the lights went out. And now the part that people find genuinely hard to hear. Water goes two directions. Sewage in most American cities doesn't flow downhill the whole way. Terrain doesn't cooperate. So the system uses lift stations, pumping stations, that catch wastewater in a wet well and push it up to the next gravity segment. There are thousands of them under a major city, all electric. Many with no backup at all. When they stop, the wet wells keep filling. The clock on that is measured in hours, not days. And when it runs out, the overflow doesn't politely wait. It comes up through the lowest opening available, which is a storm drain, a manhole, or a basement floor drain. That's minute 20. The lights have been off for less than half an hour, and we haven't gotten to the people who can't wait. At the hospital, none of this happened. When the grid failed, the transfer switch tripped, and the emergency generators came alive, and code requires them to carry the critical load within 10 seconds. 10 seconds. Operating rooms, ventilators, ICU monitors, a flicker, and then normal. Hospitals are the most prepared buildings in the country for this. They drill it. They test the generators monthly. Most keep enough diesel on site for somewhere between 1 and 4 days. So the hospital is fine. The hospital is fine if the fuel truck can reach it. And here's what almost nobody outside emergency management thinks about. The dangerous population in a blackout isn't in the hospital. It's at home. There's a federal map, a real one, maintained by the Department of Health and Human Services that exists for exactly one reason: to show emergency responders where electricity-dependent people live, street by street, before a disaster hits. Because millions of Americans on Medicare alone rely on medical equipment that runs on a wall outlet, home oxygen concentrators, ventilators, feeding pumps, power wheelchairs, refrigerated medication that stops being medication when it gets warm. An oxygen concentrator doesn't have a 4-day diesel tank. It has a battery measured in hours, if it has one at all. And the dialysis clinic that 150 people in your zip code depend on 3 times a week. The one with the pumps and the water treatment system and the sterilization equipment is closed, not damaged. Just closed because it runs on the same grid you do. Those people are not in crisis at minute 20. They're in crisis somewhere around hour 36, which means the single most important thing happening right now is happening in a room none of them will ever see, and it's the reason this entire video exists. Minute 40. In a control center, a small group of people are making the decisions that determine whether this ends tonight or ends in a season. And the problem they're facing sounds like a riddle. To restart a power plant, you need electricity. Not a little, a lot. A large coal or gas plant needs enormous amounts of power just to wake up to run the boiler, feed water pumps, the fans, the fuel systems, the control room, the cooling. That power normally comes from the grid. But the grid is what's dead. So the entire thing is a closed loop. No power without plants. No plants without power. The solution is a category of generator most people have never heard of. Black start units. Machines specifically designed and contracted to come to life from nothing, usually hydroelectric dams, which need only enough energy to open a gate, and small gas turbines that can be spun up by an onboard diesel engine, like an enormous version of the starter motor in your car. There are not many of them. Their locations are among the more sensitive pieces of information in the country. But before any of that can happen, there's a dependency underneath it that turns the riddle into something closer to a trap. Most American electricity now comes from natural gas, and natural gas doesn't arrive on its own. It's pushed through pipelines by compressor stations spaced along the route, boosting the pressure every 100 miles or so, and a growing number of those compressors run on electric motors. Wellheads need power. Processing plants need power. The equipment that keeps gas from freezing in a cold snap needs power. So the plant you're trying to restart needs fuel, and the fuel needs the grid you're trying to restart. That is not a hypothetical. In Texas, in 2021, gas supply fell apart. At the precise moment, gas generation was the only thing standing between the state and darkness. The plants weren't refusing to run. There was nothing to burn. And now, the delicate part. You can't just switch the grid back on. And the reason is a phenomenon with an almost gentle name: cold load pickup. On a normal day, your neighborhood's appliances are staggered. Your refrigerator cycles, then your neighbor's, then the one across the street, never all together. That randomness is silently baked into every calculation the grid makes. Engineers call it diversity, and it's the only reason the wires in your street are thick enough. A blackout destroys diversity. Every thermostat, every compressor, every water heater, every one of them has been off for an hour, and every one of them is now waiting. Restore power to that neighborhood, and they don't come back gradually. They come back in the same instant, all of them, and the demand can spike to 2 or 3 times normal and stay there until the houses catch up. So if you energized a whole city at once, that surge would crush the small amount of generation you've managed to start. The frequency would collapse, and you would black out everything you just recovered in seconds. So it's done in fragments, islands. The black start unit energizes a single line, a cranking path to reach one larger plant, and brings it up. Then a small amount of load is added, carefully, in blocks, because a generator needs load to stay stable, and too much load kills it. Then another plant. Then another island forms somewhere else. And then the 2 islands have to be joined, which is where it gets genuinely nerve-wracking. 2 separately restarted sections of grid are each humming along at their own 60 hertz, but not necessarily in phase with each other. Connect them at the wrong instant, and you slam 2 enormous rotating machines together out of sync. Equipment shears. Both islands go down. You start over. This is why grid restoration is measured in hours and days, not minutes. It's not a switch. It's stitching a continent back together, one piece at a time, with the whole thing threatening to unravel every time you add a stitch. In 2003, they were good and they were lucky, and most of those 50 million people had power within 2 days. Parts of Ontario ran on rolling blackouts for a week, 2 days, for a failure that damaged almost nothing. And that word nothing is the hinge this entire hour turns on. Because everything you've just heard describes a grid that protected itself. Breakers tripped, generators disconnected, lines de-energized. Every one of those things is reversible. That's the whole design philosophy. When the system is in danger, sacrifice the service to save the hardware. So here is the question that changes the shape of this. What happens when the hardware is what breaks? On an April night in 2013, someone cut a fiber optic cable near San Jose, California, and then opened fire on an electrical substation with a rifle. 19 minutes of gunfire. 17 transformers destroyed, not shut down, destroyed, leaking oil until they overheated and failed. Grid operators managed to reroute power around it and prevented a blackout entirely. Most people in the Bay Area never knew anything happened. The substation took roughly a month to bring back. And in 2015, in Ukraine, operators watched their own cursors move across their screens without them. Attackers had gotten into the control systems and opened the breakers themselves, remotely, while locking the operators out of their own network. Around 250,000 people lost power. The utility restores service by driving crews to the substations and closing the switches by hand. Both of those were survivable because the number of destroyed components was small. Now understand what a large power transformer actually is. It is not a part you buy. It is the size of a small house. It weighs hundreds of tons. It is custom engineered for one specific location on one specific grid, and a substantial share of them are built overseas. As of this year, lead times for that equipment in the United States have stretched to as long as 4 years. 4 years. Move one from a warehouse? There is no warehouse. Truck one across the country? A load that size needs specialized rail cars, of which there are only a handful in existence permits, from every state it crosses, and bridges rated to carry it. So run the scenario one more time, with one variable changed. Not breakers tripping. Not generators disconnecting. Hardware a dozen of these, in the wrong places, at the same time. The first 60 minutes look identical. The traffic, the towers, the water, all of it exactly the same. The difference doesn't show up in minute 60. It shows up in month 6. And if you think that's a distant, theoretical, 1 in a million scenario that the American grid has always held, that it bent in 2003 and bent again and never quite broke. In February of 2021, during a winter storm, the Texas grid came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of exactly this. Not a blackout. A total, uncontrolled collapse, the kind that takes generators offline hard and leaves an entire state performing a black start from zero in freezing temperatures for weeks or months. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That's how long the operators had. That's the entire margin between the worst power outage in Texas history and something with no modern precedent in the United States. And the thing that saved it wasn't a backup system. It wasn't a safety net. It was a handful of people in a control room choosing to cut power to millions of customers on purpose in the middle of a freeze, knowing exactly what that decision would cost, because the alternative was losing everything. They made that call with about 270 seconds to spare, which means the next time your lights go out and you're standing in that specific silence, waiting for the hum to come back, somebody, somewhere, is watching a number on a screen, and the only question that matters is how far it's already fallen.